Bitterroot Valley, Montana. December 1881. One cabin stood silent in the snow while every other homestead burned would like it was going out of style. Smoke poured from chimneys up and down the valley, except from one odd, triangular structure that barely seemed to need a fire at all. The winter of 1881 hit western Montana with a cruelty nobody expected. Temperatures dropped to -30 and stayed there for weeks. Men spent half their waking hours splitting frozen wood and feeding fires that couldn't keep up. But at the end of a narrow trail, past the old sawmill, there was a cabin that didn't follow the rules. A cabin people had called a shed, a tin house, a joke, until they measured what was happening inside. This is the story of how one man's mistake became the most copied design in the Bitterroot Valley, and how a structure everyone mocked outperformed every traditional cabin when it mattered most. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button. By the end of this story, you're going to see the exact number that made the whole valley rethink what a cabin should look like. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this technique worked in Montana, and it'll work wherever winter tries to kill you. Nobody expected much from Caleb Hardin. He wasn't a master builder. He wasn't a stonemason or an architect. He was a sawmill hand who'd save enough to buy 40 acres of rocky ground at the edge of the valley, and he needed shelter before the snow came. Caleb had timber. Not much, but enough. What he didn't have was time, and he didn't have help. The valley's experienced builders were booked through autumn, raising proper cabins for families with money. Caleb was on his own, and winter was 6 weeks out. He'd grown up in a logging camp where his father had taught him to frame sheds and equipment shelters. Simple A-frame structures that went up fast and stayed up through heavy snow. They weren't homes. They were just covers. But Caleb looked at his pile of lumber, looked at the calendar, and made a decision nobody understood. He'd build an A-frame, steep-pitched, with the roofline running straight to the ground on both sides. No walls, really. Just one continuous plane from ridge to foundation. When his nearest neighbor, a man named Fenton, came by to see the framing, he stopped his horse and stared. "That's your cabin?" Caleb wiped sawdust from his hands. "It'll do." Fenton shook his head. "Looks like you're building a shed for your tools, not a house for yourself." "Sheds keep things dry," Caleb said. "They don't keep men warm." Caleb didn't argue. He just kept working. He didn't have the luxury of proving anyone wrong with words. He'd have to do it with results. By mid-October, the frame was up. The structure sat low and compact, almost predatory in its shape. The roof, if you could call it that, swept down at a 55-degree angle and met a stone foundation Caleb had been laying for weeks. He'd pulled flat river rock from the creek bed, stones the size of dinner plates, and built a base that rose 2 feet above grade. The floor inside was stone, too. Caleb had covered it with sand and clay, then set more flat stones on top, tight and level. People passing on the road didn't wave anymore. They just looked, and then they looked away, like they were embarrassed for him. One woman, a widow who ran a small dairy, told Fenton outright, "That's not a cabin. That's a tent someone gave up on." It didn't look like the log cabins dotting the valley. It didn't have the honest, square-shouldered posture of a homestead. It looked angular, temporary, unfinished, like Caleb had run out of ambition halfway through and settled for a roof with delusions. But Caleb kept working. He chinked the seams with moss and clay. He built a small iron stove near the center, with a chimney running straight up through the ridge. And he piled stones, heavy, dense river stones, around the base of that stove, inside and out, until the whole center of the cabin sat on a bed of thermal mass that weighed close to 2 tons. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was just using what he had. The stones were free. The timber wasn't. And the compact triangular volume meant he'd heat less air, burn less wood, and maybe survive his first winter without going broke on firewood. Nobody asked him about his plan. By the time November rolled in, they'd already written him off. The A-frame went up faster than any cabin in the valley that season, but nobody called it impressive. They called it desperate. Caleb's design was unconventional in every way. Traditional cabins had vertical walls, a separate roof structure, and a loft where heat could rise and get trapped or wasted, depending on how you looked at it. Caleb's cabin had none of that. The walls were the roof. The entire structure was one geometric form, a triangle 55 degrees from peak to base, with no wasted space, no attic, no second story. The footprint was small, 16 feet wide at the base, 24 feet long. The interior peaked at just over 12 feet, which meant you could stand upright in the center, but had to duck as you moved toward the edges. It felt more like a tent than a building, and that's exactly what people said. You planning to live in there, or just store your traps? A man named Bridger asked one afternoon, watching Caleb seal the seams with pine pitch. Live in it, Caleb said. Where's your loft? Don't need one. Bridger laughed. Heat rises, harden. You know that, right? Without a loft, all that warmth is just going to press against your roof and leak out. Caleb didn't answer. He'd thought about that. The steep pitch meant heat would rise, yes, but it wouldn't have far to go. The entire interior was compressed. Less volume meant less air to heat. And the roof itself, built with double-layered planks and packed with sawdust insulation, would hold that heat longer than Bridger thought. But the real secret, the part nobody was paying attention to, was the stone. Caleb had used more stone than any cabin in the valley. Not because he planned it that way, but because he had stone and he didn't have money for more lumber. The foundation was stone. The floor was stone. And around the central stove, he'd stacked river rock in a wide, low platform that radiated out 4 feet in every direction. He wasn't thinking about thermal mass. He was thinking about durability and about not having to replace a wooden floor every few years. But the effect was the same. Rock holds heat. Sandstone, river rock, limestone, dense, heavy stone absorbs the warmth from a fire and releases it slowly for hours after the flames die. Caleb's cabin sat on a bed of stone that weighed nearly 4,000 pounds. The stove itself sat in the middle of that mass, surrounded by it, radiating into it. And because the cabin's interior was so compact because there were no high ceilings or distant corners, that heat had nowhere to go but into the living space. From the outside, though, none of that was visible. What people saw was a lopsided tent with a stone skirt, built by a man who didn't know any better. One evening in late November, a respected builder named Orson Teague stopped by. Teague had been in the valley for 15 years. He'd built some of the finest cabins in the region, proper structures with dovetail corners, fieldstone chimneys, and lofts big enough to sleep 6. He looked at Caleb's A-frame the way you'd look at a broken wagon wheel. You're going to freeze in that thing, Teague said flatly. Caleb looked up from the stove. He was fitting. Maybe. No maybe about it. Steep walls, no loft space, stone floor. You'll burn twice the wood just to stay miserable. That's a summer camp, harden, not a winter cabin. Teague's voice wasn't cruel, just factual. He'd seen men make mistakes before. This was just another one. Caleb didn't defend himself. He just nodded, thanked Teague for stopping by, and went back to work. The next week, the first snow came. And the week after that, the temperature dropped below 0 and didn't come back up. By early December, the Bitterroot Valley was locked in cold that made men question their choices. Morning temperatures hovered around -15. Nights dropped to -25, sometimes lower. The kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made steel brittle. Every cabin in the valley was burning wood constantly. Fires roared from dawn to midnight, stoves glowing red, chimneys belching smoke into the frozen air. And still, people woke to frost on the inside of their walls. Caleb's A-frame, though, barely smoked. Neighbors noticed. Fenton, passing by on his way to check trap lines, saw Caleb outside, splitting wood in the midday sun. A small pile, nothing like the cords other men were burning through. How much you burning a day? Fenton asked. 4, maybe 5 logs, Caleb said. Fenton frowned. That's it. You must be freezing in there. Caleb shrugged. I'm fine. Fenton didn't believe him. Nobody did. The assumption was that Caleb was either lying or suffering in silence, too proud to admit his experiment had failed. The widow who ran the dairy, a woman named Iris Caldwell, was more direct. She told Bridger, loud enough for half the settlement to hear, that Caleb's cabin was a death trap waiting to prove itself. He's got no real walls, she said. Heat rises and escapes. That stone floor is stealing warmth right out of the air. And that stove? It's too small for that space. He'll make it a Christmas. Maybe, after that, he'll be knocking on someone's door begging for a real roof. Bridger agreed. Man built himself a fancy tent and called it a home. Winter doesn't care about clever. It cares about heat. And he's not making enough of it. Even Teague, the builder who'd warned Caleb in November, mentioned it at the trading post. I give him until January. He'll either move into town or freeze, try and prove a point. The judgment wasn't mean-spirited. It was just the valley's collective experience speaking. Everyone knew what worked. Thick log walls, a good loft, a big firebox, and plenty of wood. Caleb's design violated all of that. It looked wrong. It felt wrong. And when something looked wrong and felt wrong, it usually was wrong. But Caleb didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just kept his fire low, his door sealed, and his woodpile modest. Inside, the cabin was holding steady at 68 degrees. The stone floor, which everyone assumed would suck heat out of the air, was doing the opposite. It was absorbing warmth from the stove all day and radiating it back all night. The compact volume meant the heat had nowhere to go, and the steep walls, which Bridger said would leak warmth, were actually trapping it. Rising heat pressed against insulated planes and spread evenly across the interior. Caleb didn't know all the science. He just knew he was comfortable, and he wasn't burning much wood. But outside, the consensus was clear. The A-frame was a mistake, and winter would expose it. Then, in mid-December, the cold turned serious. A high-pressure system settled over western Montana and refused to move. Temperatures dropped to -30 and stayed there for days. Then a week. Then two. The kind of cold that split tree trunks and froze rivers solid. The kind of cold that turned a poorly sealed cabin into a desperate fight for survival. Men were burning through it faster than they could split it. Some families ran low and started rationing, letting fires die down at night and waking to frozen water buckets. Others burned furniture, fence posts, anything that would catch. The trading post ran out of kerosene. The settlers who'd stocked poorly were in real trouble. And then the wind came. For 3 straight days, a brutal north wind tore through the valley, driving the cold into every crack, every gap, every poorly chinked seam. Cabins that had felt solid suddenly felt porous. Heat poured out. Cold poured in. Fires roared. Stoves glowed red-hot, and still the interiors dropped into the 40s. Fenton's cabin, a solid double-wall log structure with a good chimney, was burning 6 cords a week. He was feeding the fire every 4 hours, day and night, just to keep his family above 50 degrees. Bridger's place was worse. His loft, which he'd always praised for trapping heat, was now trapping it too well. All the warmth rose and stayed up there, leaving the main floor ice cold. His children slept downstairs, huddled near the stove in blankets, while the loft above them stayed warm and useless. Teague, the respected builder, had his own problems. His large, well-built cabin was drafty in ways he hadn't anticipated. The wind found seams he didn't know existed. His firebox was deep and his chimney drew well, but the sheer volume of air he was trying to heat, 2 stories plus a loft, meant he was burning wood faster than anyone else in the valley. People stopped visiting each other. Traveling meant losing heat, and heat was everything. But Caleb's A-frame just sat there, quiet as ever. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a thin, lazy line, not the thick, desperate plume of a fire burning hard. Just a trickle. On the 5th day of the wind, Fenton couldn't take it anymore. He walked a half-mile to Caleb's place, knocked on the door, and waited. Caleb opened it. He was in shirt sleeves. Fenton stared. "You're not cold." "No," Caleb said. "How much were you burning?" 3 logs yesterday. Maybe 4 today." Fenton felt the air leaking out of the doorway. It was warm, not just tolerable warm. He could feel it on his face. "Ow," Fenton asked. Caleb looked at him, then stepped aside. "Come in. I'll show you. Stay with me," because what happened next made the expert eat his words. If you want to see more survival engineering that actually worked, hit that subscribe button now, and don't forget to comment where you're watching from. You want to see the number that changed everything. Fenton stepped inside, and the heat hit him like a wall. Not the dry, scorching heat of a fire burning too hot. Just steady, even warmth that wrapped around him the moment he crossed the threshold. He looked around. The interior was smaller than he expected, but it didn't feel cramped. The ceiling rose to a sharp peak above him, and the walls, really just the underside of the roof, sloped down at steep angles on both sides. There was no loft, no wasted space, just one continuous, triangular room with the stove sitting in the center on a raised platform of stone. And that stone was warm. Fenton could feel it through his boots. The entire floor radiated heat, not aggressively, but constantly. It was like standing on sun-warmed rock in late summer, except it was the middle of December and 30 below outside. "You heated your floor?" Fenton asked. "Didn't mean to," Caleb said. "Just needed something solid under the stove." Stone was free. Fenton crouched and put his hand on the floor. The stone was warm to the touch, almost hot near the stove, but even 6 feet away it still held heat. He looked at the stove itself. It was small, nothing like the big fireboxes most men were running. The fire inside was low, barely more than coals. "When did you last feed that?" Fenton asked. Caleb glanced at the stove. 4 hours ago. Maybe 5. And it's still this warm in here. It'll stay warm till morning. Fenton stood and walked the perimeter of the cabin. The walls were tight. No gaps, no drafts. The insulation, sawdust packed between double planks, was doing its job. But it was the geometry that struck him. The entire space was compact, efficient. There was no corner where heat could hide, no high ceiling where warmth could escape and go unused. Everything was tight, close, contained. He turned back to Caleb. "How much wood are you actually burning?" 3, maybe 4 logs a day, Caleb said. "Depends on the wind." Fenton did the math in his head. He was burning 15 logs a day. Some days, 20. And his cabin was barely staying at 50 degrees. "That's not possible," Fenton said. "It's what I'm burning." Fenton walked back to the door, opened it, and felt the cold rush in. Then he closed it and watched the warmth settle back almost immediately. The stone floor, the tight walls, the low ceiling, it was all working together. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded, stepped outside, and walked home. The next morning, Fenton came back. This time he brought Bridger with him. Caleb was outside, splitting wood. "Not much, just a few logs for the day." "Can we see inside again?" Fenton asked. Caleb waved them in. Bridger stepped through the door and stopped. His expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something close to disbelief. "When did you light the fire this morning?" Bridger asked. "I didn't," Caleb said. "Last log went in around 10 last night." Bridger pulled a small brass thermometer from his coat pocket. He brought it specifically to prove Fenton wrong. He hung it on a nail near the center of the cabin and waited. 5 minutes later, he checked it. 54 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 8 degrees above zero. The fire had been out for nearly 12 hours. Bridger stared at the thermometer. Then he looked at Fenton. Then he looked at the stone floor, still faintly warm beneath his boots. "Ow?" Bridger asked. Caleb shrugged. "Stone holds heat. Cabin small. Not much air to keep warm. Walls are sealed tight. Heat doesn't have anywhere to go, so it just stays." It wasn't a technical explanation. Caleb didn't know the terms thermal mass, radiant heat transfer, volumetric efficiency. He just knew it worked. But Bridger understood enough. The stone floor wasn't just a floor. It was a battery. All day, while the fire burned low, that 2-ton bed of river rock absorbed heat. And all night, while the fire died, it gave that heat back. Slowly, steadily, for hours. The compact interior meant there was less air to heat in the first place. A traditional cabin Bridger size would have 3 times the interior volume. That meant 3 times the air, 3 times the heat loss, 3 times the wood. And the steep walls, the feature everyone had mocked, were doing exactly what Caleb needed them to do. Heat rose, yes, but it didn't rise into a useless loft. It rose into an insulated plane that trapped it, spread it, and pushed it back down into the living space. Bridger looked at Fenton. "He's burning half what I'm burning. And he's warmer." Fenton nodded. "Less than half," Bridger corrected himself. "A third, maybe." They stood there in silence for a moment, warm and dry, while outside the wind howled and the valley burned through it like it was the only thing standing between them and death. Because for most of them it was, but not for Caleb. By that afternoon, the story had spread. Fenton and Bridger didn't embellish. They didn't need to. They just told people what they'd measured. 12 hours after the fire died, the cabin was still 54 degrees. Half the wood, maybe less. Warm floors, no drafts, no desperate middle-of-the-night feedings. The valley didn't want to believe it, but numbers don't lie. And when Teague, the man who'd told Caleb he'd freeze, finally walked over to see for himself, he didn't say a word. He just stood inside the A-frame for 10 minutes, feeling the warmth radiate up from the stone, and then walked back to his own cabin without comment. But 2 weeks later, he started laying a stone floor in his own place. Spring came slowly to the Bitterroot Valley, but when it finally arrived, the conversation had changed. Caleb's A-frame wasn't a joke anymore. It was a case study. Men who'd mocked the design in November were now asking questions. How thick was the stone base? What angle was the roof pitch? How much insulation did he use? Did the stove need to be centered, or could it sit off to one side? Caleb answered honestly. He didn't claim to have invented anything. He just used what he had and built what made sense. The stone was free. The timber was limited. The compact design saved materials and time. The efficiency was a bonus he hadn't fully anticipated. But the valley saw something else. They saw a solution. By late April, 3 more A-frames were under construction. One belonged to a trapper named Howell, who'd spent the winter burning through his savings just to stay warm. He built his A-frame with a steeper pitch, 60 degrees instead of 55, and used limestone instead of river rock. The result was similar. Warm floors, low wood consumption, no wasted space. Another belonged to a young couple who'd just arrived from Illinois. They'd planned to build a traditional cabin, but after talking to Fenton and seeing Caleb's place, they changed their minds. Their A-frame was smaller, just 14 feet wide, but they added extra stone around the base and insulated the roof with a double layer of sod. It stayed warm enough that they didn't light a fire at all on mild spring nights. The third belonged to Teague. He didn't abandon his main cabin, but he built an A-frame workshop behind it, steep-walled, stone-floored, insulated with sawdust and clay. He used it through the following winter and reported back to the settlement that it stayed 15 to 20 degrees warmer than his main house, using half the wood. The design spread quietly, organically. No one made speeches about it. No one wrote articles. It just worked and people noticed and they adapted. By the winter of 1883, there were 9 A-frame structures in the Bitterroot Valley. Some are full cabins. Some are workshops or storage sheds. A few were hybrid designs, traditional log walls with A-frame roofs and stone floors. Each one was different. Each one was adapted to the builder's needs, materials, and site. But they all shared the same principles. Compact volume, thermal mass, steep insulation, minimal waste. The valley didn't call them Caleb's cabins or give them a fancy name. They just called them practical. And in a place where winter could kill you, practical was the highest compliment. Iris Caldwell, the widow who'd called the A-frame a death trap, stopped by Caleb's place one afternoon in late autumn. She didn't apologize. She just asked if he'd help her retrofit her dairy barn with a stone floor and a steep roof section for winter lambing. Caleb said yes. Fenton, who'd been the first to doubt and the first to believe, built an A-frame grain shed that stayed dry and warm enough to keep his seed stock from freezing. He told Caleb it was the smartest building he'd ever put up. Even Bridger, who'd laughed the hardest, admitted quietly that he wished he'd built differently. "I'm stuck with what I've got," he said. "But my son's building next year. I'm telling him to go steep and go small." The shift wasn't dramatic. It was incremental. One cabin at a time, one conversation at a time, the valley learned what Caleb had stumbled into by accident. Efficiency isn't about tradition. It's about understanding heat, mass, and geometry. It's about using less to achieve more. And sometimes, the joke everyone dismisses is just an idea that hasn't been tested yet. By 1885, 17 structures in the region had incorporated some version of Caleb's design. Steep roofs, stone thermal mass, Compact interiors. Tight seals. Nobody called them jokes anymore. They called them warm. The A-frame wasn't invented in the 1960s as a vacation novelty. Triangular shelters have been around for centuries. Teepees, wigwams, alpine huts, because the geometry works. Heat rises into a concentrated point. Walls double as roofs. Surface area is minimized. And when you combine that shape with thermal mass, stone, clay, rammed earth, you get a structure that holds warmth long after the fire dies. Caleb Hardin didn't set out to revolutionize frontier architecture. He just wanted to survive the winter without going broke. But in doing so, he rediscovered something indigenous builders and alpine communities had known for generations. Small, steep, and heavy beats big, square, and hollow when fuel is scarce and cold is constant. The principle still works today. Modern A-frames, ships, and passively heated homes all rely on the same physics. Thermal mass stores energy, compact volume reduces loss, and good insulation keeps it all inside. Caleb's cabin stood for 43 years. It outlasted most of the traditional log structures built in the same decade. When it finally came down, it wasn't because of rot or collapse. It was because the valley had grown and someone wanted the land for a road. But the idea never left. 12 hours. 54 degrees. Half the wood. That's not luck. That's geometry and mass working together. That's what happens when you stop building the way you're supposed to and start building the way that works. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because next week we're covering the root cellar design that kept food frozen without ice for 8 months straight, and you're not going to want to miss it. Welcome to the Valley. Stay warm. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.